Welcome to the first video interview of Colombia Reports. My name is Adrian Alsema, and today I'm talking to Carl Johnson of Conflict Response, an NGO that does research on conflict and peace in Colombia. And today we're going to talk about the Comando Central. What's the full name of the EMC, Kyle?
Well, the EMC like to be called the FARC, but everyone just calls them the Estado Mayor Central.
Yeah, the Estado Mayor Central de las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, Ejército del Pueblo.
That's how they like it.
That's the most interesting name for a guerrilla group ever. Can you tell me where the EMC, what the origins of the EMC are? Because they used to belong to the FARC.
Yeah, exactly. So the first units that ended up creating the EMC were based in Guaviare, Southern Meta, parts of Caquetá, kind of the Amazon region. So they were like the first front of the FARC in June 2016 publicly announced that they weren't going to be part of the peace process anymore. December 2016, the FARC kick out some commanders from different fronts in the area, including Gentil Duarte, which was like the EMC's first big public commander in 2016. And later, throughout the peace process, different groups that had either rejected the process or had participated in the peace process then went back to the war. And different parts of the country started to kind of organize and appear. And the EMC, or what ended up being the EMC, ends up kind of bringing in a bunch of these groups, whether they be in Arauca, Caratumbo, Antioquia, Cauca, Nariño, Putumayo, like just
Yeah,
kind of
because
bringing these different groups on board
like what is
process.
now called the EMC used to only have, like, when they started they only had a few hundred members, didn't they? And they were
Exactly.
only active in like the Eastern Plains and in the border of the Amazon region.
Yeah, exactly. That's how they first started out. And I think in 2017, the estimates what they had around 300 to 400 members out in the Eastern Plains exclusively. Um, but eventually, yeah, once they start picking up other people, either by bringing them on board or by giving them support, and that way kind of gaining their loyalty, yeah, their numbers start to grow, but not drastically. I mean, if in Arauca, when the first kind of dissident group appeared, it probably had 60 people in it. In Antioquia, probably even less than that when the first kind of dissidents appeared. In Caratumbo, also very small group of people. So they basically either brought these small groups on board to the project, or they gave them support like money and weapons, and that kind of bought their loyalty to the project as well. But yeah, they really started small and kind of started growing consistently from there.
Now, the when the FARC was still active, their organization was quite hierarchical. So, like, you had a supreme commander. In the end, it was Timochenko, and there was like some democracy in the organization, but like a clear hierarchy of power. Like in the recent report you put out on the disidencias, let me look up the name: Dos caminos de una guerra en construcción, or two roads of a war under construction.
War
You
in the making.
portrayed like the EMC more of a bottoms up federation kind. Like, how would you describe it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. It's kind of like two things were happening kind of at once. It's very bottom up, definitely, because it would bring most of the units that belonged to the EMC as the EMC as we knew it 3 weeks ago, let's say. Most of the units that belonged were had been created locally, operated where their commanders previously operated, and kind of just started building this hierarchy from the bottom. Yeah, literally from the bottom up, from these local units trying to make something larger at a higher level. At the
And
same
when you
time,
say so how did these groups create? Are these like former FARC members who rearmed and rejoined a dissident organization, or were there like external, like for example, like gangs, for example, that ended up joining, or both?
In the EMC, in their beginnings for each unit, you kind of have a mix. You have a mix of people who rejected the peace process and never participated, and then you have some people who did participate and went back to guns. So you have this kind of mix in the beginning. And this is mainly the case for people who are commanders, front commanders today, or mid-level commanders. And but also at the same time, they also started recruiting ex-combatants who had joined the process and went back. But mainly nowadays, a large amount of the recruits, and this percentage continuously increases, is new people who had never been part of the war at all. And their first experience now being in the war is with the EMC.
And these are people like between the ages of like 16, 20, 20 something.
Yeah, probably around there. Anywhere between, yeah, like 14 and 22 is going to probably be the bulk
Um,
of the new recruits these days.
okay. Now the FARC always had like a clear purpose, like they wanted to overthrow the state. I haven't heard the EMC say such a thing.
New. It's tough to actually know what their overall purpose is. They haven't been very clear with it. But they've given some hints, and they definitely want to take over again, or retake over what they perceive to be the FARC's territories. So they wherever the FARC was previous to the peace agreement, they kind of want to regain that territory, if you can be generous with the idea that it belonged to the FARC to begin with.
But without a
Um,
clear purpose, and like when they formed the dissidents, like did they give a reason for it?
yeah, they gave a bunch of reasons to reject the peace agreement. And that was enough for them to say, this is why we're staying in the war. But now that there is, so they said, it's agreement meant to demobilize the FARC. It's not going to make any changes to the countryside. The government's not going to implement the agreement. This is just the elite tricking the FARC into signing a peace agreement that's not real, or kind of not going to change anything. They also accused the old secretariat of the FARC of selling out, basically, and selling the organization off. Um, but they gave a lot of reasons to say why they didn't like the peace agreement. But once they stay in the war. What's the point of staying in the war is really where they haven't developed a strong discourse.
Yeah,
And this
other
I
than
can
that they
say,
turned out to be kind of correct in their initial crit. I mean, like their skepticism turned out to be pretty valid if you look at like how difficult the peace process has been.
they've actually gained a lot of legitimacy in some areas because of that. But it's also a conveniently self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes,
Yeah.
because often the government, I don't think correctly, but the government, both Duque and Petro, have said, security is so bad in some areas we can't implement the peace agreement. I think is a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's that big of a stretch. But sometimes the security is so bad because of the EMC itself.
Yeah.
So the EMC is also an obstacle to the implementation of the peace agreement, and then they turn around and point the finger at the government for not implementing the peace agreement. But so there's some truth to that skepticism, like you say, definitely, but they're also part of the problem.
Yeah.
So it's very, very
Clearly.
convenient at the same time when you can point to a problem that you're the cause of, but blame someone else. Yeah,
Now,
that works out well.
the election of Petro changed a lot. Like suddenly the
Yeah.
EMC did agree to like renewed negotiations. And but during the same period, well, particularly like between the demobilization and disarmament of the FARC in 2017 and
Mhm.
2022, like the EMC pretty much try to recover areas that were well lost as a consequence of the demobilization of the FARC. Um, and they began like creating a sort of like a military structure, like with blocks, like with regional blocks that had regional or local units. Um, so they entered the peace talks, the like formal peace talks began in October last year,
Yeah, that was when they officially began the formal peace talks. Yeah.
and that never really resulted in anything concrete, did it?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was some difficulty around the peace talks getting anywhere. I think the first one was the focus by both the EMC and the government at the time. So the first meeting between the EMC and the Petro administration was in September 2022. Um, and there between then and October, they pretty much only talked about ceasefires. Um, Eventually, they would start talking about some agenda points, but not many. Some methodological points, but again, not many. So they spent a year basically discussing a ceasefire, and that was it. And that year is in the exploratory phases when you really need to look at peace process design, like what's going to be the methodology, how is this going to actually work, what's this going to look like, what is going to be our agenda, what issues are we going to talk about, how are we going to talk about them, etc. They didn't discuss any of that. They just focused on the ceasefire, on ceasefires, on ceasefires, on ceasefires. And
Yeah, the
so that really kind of, and the fact that the ceasefires, at least the public perception was that this hasn't changed the violence on the ground, and often that was true.
Mhm.
Um, Also made it seem like, okay, you just spent a year talking about ceasefires that didn't change anything. So when you're looking for like a victory or some sort of results from this process, they really haven't had anything too concrete to point to. It's all been There have been some important advances, but they're all a little abstract for public opinion. You know?
and now there's like a whole new thing because I believe it was last month that the government suspended the ceasefire in the Nariño, Cauca, and Valle del Cauca provinces in the southwest of Colombia.
Yeah.
And then everything started falling apart, it seems. Like, can you tell me what happened after the suspension of the ceasefire?
Yeah, basically, I mean, in a short version of things, once the government broke the ceasefire in those three provinces you mentioned, some of the units in the EMC um, started to or took a position that the organization has to either have a ceasefire everywhere or there's no ceasefire at all, and that it shouldn't accept the suspension, the partial suspension by the government. It's kind of everyone has a ceasefire, or no one has a ceasefire. And so that was one position that appeared within the EMC. But another position appeared as well, which was you guys in the Southwest caused this scenario. Like you caused this situation because you killed indigenous leaders in a brutal way, in a way that is just kind of a little bit unacceptable. And so this other position was the Southwest have to kind of deal with the consequences of their actions and maybe come out and accept the responsibility that they messed up really bad and that come up with some sort of commitments.
So at that
Um,
point, you got a dissidence within the dissidents,
a little bit. You
and
just have these two different positions, right? But then they met in Cauca with different regional commanders met in Cauca to try to resolve these differences, and they couldn't. Um, Simply, both sides were very kind of fixed in their positions, and when they were in Cauca in this meeting, they learned that Petro had suspended the ceasefire. So they knew that this happened, or it was in
wait,
basically they
suspended the
didn't have
national ceasefire?
suspended the regional ceasefire. When Petro makes the
Okay,
announcement, or what he, hold on, let me remember if I remember this correctly. If he makes a ceasefire, or he just calls them narcos, I think it was the same thing. He suspends the regional ceasefire um, while these guys are meeting in Cauca. And then with that, they can't continue the meeting. And
no.
so there was an opportunity to kind of see if they could come. to some sort of agreement amongst themselves. Then they couldn't. Time ran out, and each one just kind of stayed in their position. And so when there's this special meeting after the breaking of the ceasefire, and if we remember in that time, this was only like a month ago, there were discussions whether the process in general was going to continue or not, or if the government was going to break off the whole process. So in order to try to discuss this and see what can happen, they call for a special meeting in San Vicente del Caguan. Um, and only a couple guys show up because
This was last
it
week,
wasn't
right?
this was last week and it wasn't authorized that everyone should go by Mordisco. But Calarca and Andre and other regional leaders show up. And so that's where I think that point right there is really where you see
The
like
split.
internal split and disobedience because Mordisco did not tell anyone to go.
Yeah, now
And they
the
went.
lead negotiator of the government, Camilo Gonzalez,
Mhm.
said yesterday that the government was going to continue talking with the EMC, but that this was going to be led by Andre Avendaño,
Mhm.
and that Ivan Mordisco was out.
Yeah.
Um, can you tell me um, who these talks are going to be with, and who is out with Mordisco?
Yeah, yeah. So, like you mentioned earlier, the EMC kind of organized into regional blocks, right? The upside that makes it a little easier to follow is that the splinter internally is by block,
Mm-hmm.
basically. So you have two blocks who are going to be at the table. The first is the Magdalena Medio block, which operates in Caratumbo, southern Bolivar, and then a chunk of Antioquia, maybe the northeast bit of Antioquia. Um, and so the Magdalena Medio Bloc is led by John Mechas, who was kind of famous for ordering the attack on Duque's helicopter in Cucuta a few years back. But John Mechas has some legal issues that doesn't allow him to be at the table yet. And so his kind of representative until now is Andre Avendaño. Andre is the commander of the 33rd Front, but he was the former EMC lead negotiator. Politically, in terms of the discourse, very good. And he's gonna be kind of like the guy, one of the main guys there, while Joan May just can't be at the table yet.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe never will actually be directly sitting down at the table. That's a possibility with Joan Mitchell.
So that's
And then you
basically
have,
the guerrilla groups like from the northern half of Colombia.
yeah, exactly.
And
And
is
then you
there
have
participation
Calarca.
of groups in the south, or have they all
Yeah.
joined Mordisco?
Then you've got one block in the south, the Jorge Suarez Briceño block, led by Calarca. Calarca for a while was considered like the number two of the EMC, really. Um,
And
Calarca
the
leads
Suarez Briceño
EMC.
block is like the original EMC, isn't it?
Mainly, yeah, it's a big chunk of that original EMC. So, like inside this block are different. They've reorganized over the years, but like some of the founding fronts, like the Seventh Front, the 40th Front, the 62nd Front, they're all in this block. Like I said, they've been reorganized over the years, but those founding fronts are there. Um, and so they're basically in Southern Meta, Caquetá, some parts of Huila as well. There's a new negotiator at the table who's been there with Calaca called Cipriano Cortez. Cipriano Cortez leads a unit in Eastern Huila, northeastern Huila. Um, and so that block is there as well. And then finally, what Camilo Gonzalez says, and I think is an accurate reading, I agree with his reading, is that there's a front in Putumayo in Amazonas called the Carolina Ramirez Front.
Mhm.
Carolina Ramirez is famous for its big fight with the Comandos de la Frontera. It's famous because the first suspension of the ceasefire in May of last year was because the Carolina Ramirez Front killed some young indigenous fighters who had escaped from the organization. They tracked them down and killed them. Um, that front is apparently divided in two. So you have people who stayed in the war and people who are at the negotiating table. What we don't know right now about this Carolina Ramirez Front is whether its commander, Danilo Albizu is his name, whether he's in the peace process or not. I would think he's probably not, but we just don't know as of right now.
No,
Um, so those are the guys in the peace process, and then everyone else is out. So Mordisco, everyone under his command in the southwestern, in the Amazonas bloc, which just got announced like a week ago.
hmm.
Officially, there are various fronts there. They're not in the process. The guys in the southwest are not in the process. The Western bloc. This newly created central bloc, um, which was announced maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. We don't really know if all of the fronts that are part of it are actually fronts, if they actually exist. Uh, we know that some of them do, and others we have
Or
no
it's
idea.
just an aspirational block.
Exactly, because the EMC had a strategy as of during out the peace process of reorganizing itself to make it appear stronger than kind of it actually was. And the central block looks to be part of that strategy because we can see some fronts and say, okay, these fronts exist and we know they exist and we know where they operate, etc. These other
Mhm.
ones, no idea. The only thing we have is like a propaganda poster on the side of a road. That doesn't tell you anything. But that front is not negotiating as well. And then finally, you have a front or a block. Well, it's not a block. It's called a joint command in Arauca and Casanare along the border with Venezuela. They also are not in the peace process as well. So you have
What used to be the 10th front.
it used to be the 10th and 28th front. There was a chance that they would be in the negotiations, but last week one of the commanders' girlfriends was killed in a military operation, and so I think that might have had some influence on them. So you have basically the Southwest, the border with Venezuela, and then the Amazon is not going to be in the peace process.
At the moment, we don't know if is because this could potentially lead to hostilities between these two EMC factions, if I'm correct.
Oh no, definitely, that's definitely a possibility. And Mordisco's approach to things when it's come to internal factions or internal splinters, which there haven't been many. There's been few of them, but his approach has been to use pretty heavy-handed violence. And a break on this level of block commanders and people who have worked together for a long time, et cetera. It's not clear necessarily if that's going to be the case, if he's going to take the same approach. In Caratumbo and Antioquia and all that, it'll be very difficult because he'd have to send fighters
Yeah.
from other regions to go kill them, and those fighters would probably come from Arauca. But there hasn't been a bad relationship between the units in Arauca and the units in Caratumbo. Like they've actually had a fairly good relationship. So it's not clear if they're going to be willing to go kill their former comrades. They also have a war with the ELN in Arauca right now, so they kind of have their hands full, if we could put it that way. But where we can see more direct violence is in the southeast because um, where the first front control ends in Guaviare, that's where the Jorge Suarez Briceño control begins.
Hmm.
So you actually have a border, kind of like a division of territory between these two factions now. And so you could definitely see violence there just because it's logistically very easy. They know each other. Um, but it's definitely a scenario. But we'll see if they're able to come to some sort of agreement on, you guys negotiate
Like
both the
agree
stage
to
of war
disagree.
and agree to disagree. That hasn't been the approach by Mordisco as of late, but he also hasn't had to deal with such a high level rupture or break until now. So it's definitely a possibility, but we'll see what ends up happening.
The government negotiator yesterday hinted that there was going to be a reconsideration of the ceasefire because like that obviously hasn't yet been adapted to this new situation.
Mhm.
Um, but the government doesn't seem very keen on going back to war. Am I correct?
It depends. Here we have to open up like the black box of the government. Um, I think generally the High Commissioner for Peace's office and has been pushing generally to always maintain ceasefires. The Ministry of Defense is very much okay with going back to war. I think the armed forces have felt that they've had their hands tied unfairly as of now. Whether that belief is correct or not, that's kind of what they feel like. And so I think they would be fine having an opportunity to attack the EMC. And oddly enough, Petro in the last maybe 8 months or so, since August of last year, has kind of been walking this weird balance of wanting to have a ceasefire, but also not wanting to have a ceasefire at the same time. And this kind of gives them the opportunity to have that. You can have a ceasefire with the EMC guys that are negotiating, which I think you should maintain that. In terms of thinking about the negotiation, you want to create positive incentives for those who continue to continue to negotiate. Um, and then the government could easily say, okay, if you're not at a negotiating table, you don't get a ceasefire. That's simple. So the rest of the guys don't get a ceasefire. Um, I think that would be actually, oddly, a fairly sensible position from the government and might actually make it be a weird moment where everyone could be happy. The High Commissioner for Peace and the peace negotiators would be happy because they have good incentives to keep Kalarka and Andre at the negotiating table. And the military
And
would be happy because they'll say, finally, we can hit these guys, which we wanted to do for a while. And there's actually
you get a
good
kind of
political
carrot and stick
justification to do that.
situation, don't you?
Exactly, exactly, and it's politically completely justifiable. If you have a ceasefire at peace talks and you walk away from the table, naturally your ceasefire will no longer apply. So it could work out for kind of the different interests within the government. At the
Now,
same time.
the government came into office promoting total peace, but that seems to be um, too ambitious. Like in the case of the EMC, and quite possibly with other illegal armed groups, it appears that there's really only going to be a partial effort where there's a realistic chance of reaching an agreement before the end of Petro's presidency. Or how do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, total peace was and still is incredibly ambitious. It was kind of the only option if you wanted to negotiate because every armed group said, I'm not going to give up my weapons. I'm not going to sign an agreement if there's other armed groups still operating in the country that can come and kill me after I give up my guns. And every armed group said that about everyone else. So it was kind of forced into total peace being the only option, being very ambitious. And the problem was they didn't really strategize over it. They didn't turn it into a policy. They didn't have clear goals. They kind of let everybody in. It's been kind of an improvised process from the beginning, which does not help at all. And
But that's kind of been the
and
reality since the peace talks with the AUC, the paramilitary. It's like there was like it's like a sort of a cascading piece, if you know it. Like the violence is like increasingly more concentrated in um well, ever more concentrated areas, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. I think what you see is Colombia has this trend over time of where the violence gets more and more concentrated in increasingly specific areas. They're the same regions as we've seen for a while, but it's like in certain parts of the country, the violence has been somewhat overcome over time, and in other areas, it's just extremely difficult. Whether it was the AUC process and afterwards the AUC process, the FARC process, and now the afterwards of the FARC process. Uh, but I think what we've seen under the Petro administration is one, and actually under Duque and Petro, it's not just the not just Petro, but it's Petro definitely. He's in there with Duque. Is we're starting to see that concentration of areas is actually starting to expand a little bit. So even if there's been peace in the sense that there hasn't been armed conflict in different parts of the country that maybe 20 or 30 years ago there was armed conflict, those territories are still very vulnerable. And so under Duque and under Petro, what we're seeing is armed groups actually taking advantage of those vulnerabilities. And that's kind of the difficulty with the improvisation because there's also an improvisation with house security policy and shoring up and making sure these vulnerable areas stay free of armed conflict, whether it be security, prevention, development, peace agreements, etc. All kind of improvised with the improvisation of the
And the involvement
total
of the
peace.
local populations, like the development of local economies, etc.
Exactly. Like that is a much longer term effort. And has, even though the peace agreement from 2016 gave a lot of tools to develop those areas, because of its implementation has been slow, improvised. There's not a lot of political will behind it. It's vulnerable, and now some armed groups have taken advantage of them, which also makes the negotiating peace with all these armed groups much more difficult because the
Mm.
incentives just simply don't align. If the incentives in the traditional sense, if the incentive of negotiating peace is that you can't, the traditional most classic one is you can't achieve your goals through war. Um, but if you're expanding, then maybe you can. And so negotiating may be kind of maybe you don't have the best interest in negotiating. And so
And
that's
also
kind of
like
the difficult thing to world
certain
peace, you know?
political goals that could have been obtained by peace are also really difficult. So in the future, this would have to be like better organized. So where let's say
Yeah.
an area is like, well, let's call it pacified, like voluntarily pacified. So where the local guerrillas lay down their arm, there needs to be like an immediate economic investment, I assume.
Yeah, that's part of it. Like there needs to be an immediate response by the state, without a doubt. And that's something that Colombia has struggled with historically.
Yeah.
Coming to a peace agreement, getting a guerrilla group or paramilitaries even to give up their guns, and then the state immediately comes in and starts, whether it be development or whether it be, political participation processes, all sorts of just state building in general. Colombia has really struggled with that. And that's the difficulty. But a new difficulty is that if you add to that, all the armed groups say, I won't give up my guns because other groups might come in and kill me. And it's
Which
hard
is
to argue
exactly
against
what
that because
the
it's
AGC has
happened.
been saying since the beginning.
Exactly. And it's happened in every peace process. I
Yeah.
mean, ex-combatants have been killed in every single peace process in Colombia. That's unfortunately kind of just the historical trend. So what
Oh,
that means is if that's the case and you want these people to give up their weapons, you end up having to create a scenario where everyone gives up their weapons more or less at the same time. And that's where total peace kind of becomes the approach. But like you
oh,
say, it's got to be much better organized. It's got to be clear what the goal is after everyone gives up their weapons. It's got to have a much clearer negotiation strategy that points to like a larger political strategy because total peace isn't an end in of itself. It's really means to an end. But if it's not really defined that way, it's really hard for these processes to actually come to agreements and have a real clear form in 4 years. Because peace talks take a long time
yeah.
in general. In other countries, many processes have taken more than a decade, easily. That's not unheard of by any sense of the word. So 4 years to negotiate with a bunch of different actors at the same time requires a lot of preparation, and we just unfortunately haven't seen that. So I don't think we'll see. I don't think we'll see any agreements by the end of the Petro administration. But um, if they can kind of finish the next 2 years very well, it could be possible that the next government comes in and says, "Okay, I'm not going to break off with this process because there's actually benefits to it." But that's probably the best they can shoot for right now, and getting there is still really difficult.
Okay. Well, um, if anything substantial changes, I'll get back to you and we'll talk more.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, hopefully we have some changes and things to talk about in the next couple of years, but we'll see what happens for now.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, Carl Johnson of Conflict Response, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for the invite, man.